Just a sec. Will, welcome to Honor Cafe Hall of Heroes. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great.
So you're friends with Amos, and I've been trying to get Amos on. Amos has a ministry up here, and he feeds people to me like Bubba and some other people to do interviews. And he said you got to interview Will. You got to hear his story. He was a West Point graduate, and so we've decided to we finally got together, and you're here at the Heart Museum, and we're going to talk about your service. So when did you enter service?
1985, I started at West Point, and then I was commissioned in 1989.
1989. Where are you from originally?
Originally from Southern California, born and raised out there.
Now you're in Texas?
Yes, sir.
When did you get to Texas?
I was first stationed here after Officer Basic Course at Fort Hood, and could not wait to get back here after I retired.
Yeah, I understand that. A lot of people can't wait to get back. Where did you retire from?
So I was living in Southern California. I got out after active duty after the first Gulf War, had a civilian career in Southern California, and then as soon as I retired from that civilian career, I moved back to Texas, and I've been here since 2009 in Texas. Mm-hmm.
So what was West Point like back in the day when it was still, when you could still get away with yelling and screaming, I guess, and and all the plebe things that they did?
When I was there, it certainly didn't seem like a lot of fun, but it was a pretty amazing. It was an amazing education. It was an amazing experience. One of the really neat things about when I was there was that I was with the same group of fellow cadets for all 4 years. They didn't scramble the classes, so I went through that entire experience with the same group of people, which was fantastic. Those are lifelong friends. In fact, when I've had issues in my life, troubles, we have stacked arms and been together, and it's been quite a blessing.
Yeah, my two best friends in high school, went to West Point, and it is incredible the friendships that they talk about that they have in the relationships and all the doors that open.
Mm-hmm.
With getting an education from the academy, it's pretty remarkable. What was your job when you went into the military?
I was a field artillery officer. I selected that on purpose. I had humped a ruck for a while and decided that infantry was not for me, and looked at the other MOSs. I knew I wanted combat arms, but I thought artillery was going to be kind of the mix between being on the ground and being active, but doing something that had a little bit of technology to it.
Yeah. So when you choose artillery, do you get to choose specifically what you want to go into, or is it just broad, wide open, like anything from rockets to,
So, interesting story behind that. I actually selected a unit out of Fort Carson, Colorado, that was a 155 unit, because you select not only your branch but your duty station, and that's part of the ranking system they use there, and it's based on class rank, which is academics actually. So I had selected a 155 unit, but while I was at Officer Basic Course, that unit was deactivated, and my initial options were the DMZ in Korea, the DMZ in Korea, or the DMZ in Korea. And as it turns out, my wife was 4 months pregnant at that time. So being a young butter bar, I told the E7 that was in charge of getting these new assignments for the guys whose units was deactivated, that wasn't acceptable. And I ended up in an MLRS battery at Fort Hood. So that's how I got my introduction to Texas and fell in love with this great state.
What was that like? What was that unit like?
It was fantastic. Because it was a brand new weapon system and had never been used or fielded, I was in a Greenhorn unit, and we literally wrote the field manual for that weapon system. So it was quite an honor to be in that unit. It was only one battery in the entire 3rd Corps at that time. So, and we were attached to 1st Cav Division Artillery, so it was quite an honor to be in that unit. And we had top-notch NCOs, top-notch soldiers. They were all handpicked to serve in that unit because it was the first battery that had been fielded of MLRS.
I want you to explain that weapon system to our viewers, but before you do that, you mentioned top NCOs. When you're in the academy, do you understand at that point when you come out as a lieutenant that how much you're going to rely on your NCOs and how they can make or break you?
The academy did a very good job of having the best of the best of the best NCOs work with us in our tactical training, and those NCOs modeled everything that it was to be a non-commissioned officer, and they worked side by side with us to help us understand the role of the non-commissioned officer in the modern Army, both in a garrison capacity as well as a tactical capacity. And I kind of felt sorry for some of the guys that were in the regular Army, because the guys that we were dealing with at the academy were absolutely the best of the best. And so we spent a lot of time with the NCOs at the academy learning what their role was, how to interact with them, what we could expect. And they were dynamite, absolutely dynamite guys.
You know, I had, when I was on the 101st, we had some, obviously some West Point grads. And I was surprised because of how well they dealt with the NCOs. It was shocking how little some of the other lieutenants understood how important it was, and how their pride sent them off a cliff at times, almost literally, and land nav, because they didn't understand, the NCOs were going to make them or break them, and that's good news. That's good to hear, and it's also, it says a lot to the non-commissioned officers, because they're running the Army, and we're just kind of managing it, while they're running it.
Well, as a 22 or 23-year-old lieutenant in charge of the lives of 30, 40, 50 men potentially, you've got a lot of life lessons you need to learn. You've got an NCO that's by your side who's got a lot more life experience, a lot more tactical experience, a lot more practical experience, and not understanding how to lean on and work with that individual can be a big detriment to your career, for sure.
I had one of my first deployment. I had this incredible NCO. I mean, he was the best NCO you could ever have, and he was my right hand man. And I had a butter bar there that was pretty bad, and he was pretty clueless. And Sergeant showed up to my tent one day, and he said, Lieutenant so-and-so's trying to tell me to do this. And I said, what'd you do? He goes, I said, yes, sir, and walked away. I go, I'll handle it. And I just really chewed into him. I basically told him, he's my right-hand man. He's my NCO. He said, you're not to order him around. You discuss with me, what you think we should do, and then I'll prove it. But he's not the one that's going to be receiving your orders. And because he's an E7, he's well seasoned, and had that. So I that's really neat to hear that that you got that kind of training. Let's get back to the weapon system. Tell us about that.
So MLRS stands for Multiple Launch Rocket System, and it was originally designed to stop the Russians from rushing through an area called the Fulda Gap in Germany. That was its original idea, to stop hordes of tanks rushing into Western Europe. And to say it's the closest thing to a nuclear weapon without being nuclear is probably a pretty good description. When a battery, which consists of 10 launchers, fires its rockets, it has the capability to kill everything above ground in 10 square miles. It puts about 75,000 5-pound dual-purpose improved conventional munitions, which is about a 5-pound hand grenade, for lack of a better description, downrange, and they all land simultaneously. And a trained unit can reload and shoot that same complement of ordnance 4 minutes later. And so it's a pretty effective weapon system if you need to take out large swaths of enemy territory at once. Very, very effective weapon system. And it had never been used in combat before. And so we got the call very early when the first Gulf War broke out, and they were concerned about Saddam Hussein bum rushing Iraq.
Wow. And these would stop tanks, these weapons?
They will kill every known enemy weapon system that's above the ground. Now, bunkers, if you're in a bunker and you have an adequate overhead cover, you're going to be okay. But if you're on the surface of the ground, you are not going to survive.
Wow. So that was what year?
So 89 I graduated. I went to officer basic course during that summer, and then the early part of that year, so late 89, early 90, I joined my unit. By the summer of 91, I was standing in the middle of Iraq, kind of like the Three Stooges. Ollie, what did I get myself into? And we were deployed early because of our massive firepower capability. We went actually well ahead of the 1st Cav Division, and we were kind of on our own out in the desert because of our firepower capability and our ability to stop a massive horde kind of rush into Saudi Arabia from the Iraqis.
I'm glad you were there, and it's neat to talk to you because we've had General Hummer on the channel, and he kind of gives the view, the high altitude view of 10,000 feet, and then it's neat to talk to people on the ground because a lot of people don't realize they think the infantry goes first, and a lot of times you're setting up the support systems in place, and when you're standing there, you're thinking, well, I know what I have as a system to stop the hordes coming over, but individually I still have to now provide security for this, and that's a lot of stress. That's a lot going on as the pieces come into play.
Well, there's a funny story. So there's a job in the Army for young lieutenants. It's called movement officer, and since Vietnam we hadn't really deployed other than Grenada to go anywhere. And especially with heavy mechanized units, 1st Cavalry was the premier division, mechanized division in the entire Army. Nobody had gone anywhere, anticipated going anywhere. So I got this job as a young lieutenant to be a movement officer, and that's the guy that's responsible for getting our equipment from point A to point B. And it's a lot of paperwork and diagrams and things like that. And I got this job, and I said, I'll never do anything with this. And lo and behold, only a few months into my lieutenantship, if you will, in my new unit, we got the call to go execute and basically act on all these plans that we had put in place. So that was quite a surprise.
Did you move by rail or did you move by plane?
We moved by a combination of a little bit of everything, but actually the entire C-5 inventory, which is the largest transport airplane in the Air Force, came to the airfield that's adjacent to Fort Hood, and we loaded our equipment into those airplanes and it was flown over in order to rapidly deploy us to that theater of operations.
Were you ahead of support, like you got a bunch of MREs, but then you got there and it's like, where's my water coming from? Where am I going to have chow? Where's all that? Yeah.
So when we got there were no, and so I talked to a lot of veterans who fought in the later wars post 9/11, and they talk about things like FOBs or forward operating bases and having these structures or facilities that are built. We literally did everything that you would think of like you learned in basic training. We built our own bunkers. We built every place that we went. I felt sorry for my soldiers because every time we moved, we started building our own bunkers. We filled our own sandbags. We did all of that ourselves. There were nothing, we call it a HESCO.
Yeah.
There was no such thing as a HESCO. We didn't have any pre-built structures. We literally filled sandbags like you might have done in Vietnam or World War II. We built them from scratch every single time that we relocated in the desert. And when we got over there, our supply line went all the way back to the port of Dammam. There wasn't a support battalion that brought things to us. We had to go all the way back to the port to get our rations, our ammunition, etc. We had to drive. It was about a 350-mile round trip. And to keep 150 guys with all the things that they need and all the parts for our equipment and oil and gas and all those kind of things, we were literally making trips back and forth to that port on an every other day basis. In the 15 months that I was there, I put 110,000 miles on my Humvee.
Wow, that is incredible, and it's things you don't think about.
Mm-hmm.
We had a interview here, and we're going to post another interview with a World War II veteran. His name's Nemec, and he was in charge of logistics from moving to island at island. And at first, it doesn't seem like an exciting interview, and he probably doesn't have as many views as a lot of the interviews. But when you start to realize his responsibility in the logistical piece, you live and die by your logistics.
Mm-hmm. That brings up another fascinating, I don't know, it's a tidbit maybe, but navigating in the desert presents some really interesting issues. First off, when we were issued our topographical maps, if you're familiar with topographical maps, they have terrain features on them. The topographical maps that we got for the desert looked like blank graph paper. There was nothing on them.
Yeah.
Number one. Then number two is when you try to use a lensatic compass, which uses magnetic force to tell you what direction north is, because of the amount of ore that's in the soil there, the magnetic compass would tell you north was one direction, and then you'd move 20 meters away and it would tell you north was a completely different direction. So they were almost useless. And we were fortunate, we got a Texas Instrument device that was a prototype about a week before we deployed, and I was pretty excited about that until I figured out that it read out in latitude and longitude. And we had to figure out how to convert latitude and longitude to universal transverse Mercator, which we know as grid coordinates. So we figured out the math on how to do that, and we trained everybody, the senior NCOs and the other lieutenants, how to do that. But then when we got to Saudi Arabia, we figured out that we had crossed the prime meridian and all of our math didn't work. And we had to re-figure out again how to convert the latitude and longitude there into a new set of grid coordinates. The only reason I mention that is because if I'm shooting rockets 30 kilometers away, I have to know where I'm at in order to be safe and not hurt anybody I'm not supposed to be hurting. And I have to know where I'm at in order to accurately shoot the rockets to a target that's someplace else. And that's why the navigation becomes so important. I can't be guessing about where I'm at.
You know, we rely so much on GPS and all the new West weapon systems that is so foreign to so many people that, you know, that are serving now and served the years after you. But things happen, and probably part of the battle plan of our enemies is to get rid of our GPS, our satellites.
Mm-hmm.
So when we don't have that, you have to go back to what you just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
I often wonder if we train the soldiers to do that today, you know.
So I have a nephew that's a 13 Fox or a forward observer, and he has a watch that does much of what, it's a handheld device that ostensibly does everything that I just described. It tells him his location, he points it at the target, and when he pushes the button, all he has to do is get on the radio and tell him how many rounds he wants and what type and what the enemy is, and everything else is transmitted digitally back to the Fire Direction Center. And that whole process could be 3 or 4 minutes, was what it used to take us to do it manually, but he does it with the point of his watch, and it has laser rangefinder. He doesn't even do adjustment rounds anymore.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing technology.
Did you have to fire your system while you were there?
So we fired our system 5 different times. We did 5 different missions, and that leads in another part of my story if we're going to get into that. So prior to the ground offensive, and everybody says that the air campaign, that's always touted as the major portion of why the ground offensive war was actually so short. There was MLRS played an enormous role in softening the enemy or attriting the enemy prior to the ground offensive taking off. There were other units of MLRS that came from Germany that had been repositioned there that came and joined the fight. And on February 14th of 1991, that day is etched in my memory because that's the first time that weapon system was used in combat. And my battery was actually the first unit to actually fire because they sequenced the firing commands, but we unleashed, and I hate to use the expression, but hell's fury that night on February 14th of 1991. And the enemy was largely caught completely off guard. The weapon system, when you fire the rocket motor burns out in about 4 seconds. The rocket's going about Mach 8, and it flies under its own inertial propulsion for the balance of its 30-kilometer trajectory. There is no heat signature or anything else. There's a small pop, and then the bomblets are released from the nose cone. So the enemy has no idea that these bomblets are being released over the top of them until they start hitting the ground. So there's really no way for them to escape from it. There's no warning of an inbound rocket. So simultaneously, or within a few minutes, across the theater of operations, hell's fury was unleashed, and MLRS rockets were launched from everywhere on one single night, and it was Valentine's Day. I was really excited because that weapon system had some technical flaws. It was prone to getting stuck on the firing line, and we were always concerned about counter battery fire. That's where the enemy sees the rockets and shoots back. And that night, everything went off without a hitch, and I was pretty gung-ho and excited. My first sergeant said to me afterwards, he said, "LT, would you take a knee with me?" And I kind of looked at him. No, he was a Vietnam guy. And he had seen the effects of war, and he said to me, "Would you take a knee with me?" And I kind of looked at him funny, and he said, would you pray with me for the men downrange who are about to receive what we just did?" I still get choked up about this. And
it's okay.
After 4 years of studying at West Point and being a proud Cav soldier, for the first time, I had some notion that what I was doing had consequences. And I kind of went from gung-ho to, oh crap, what did I just do? And it stuck with me that night. And I think God had a plan for me that night, because I didn't sleep much that night. And that knot in my stomach didn't go away. And the next morning, a group of guys with beards and odd mismatched uniforms came, and they came on a helicopter that was unmarked. And they said they were looking for Lieutenant Moore. I didn't know who they were, and they showed me identification, and the identification just had their names on it, and I don't know that they were their real names. And they said that they had orders, and the orders were from 1st Cavalry Division headquarters. And they had a non-disclosure agreement for me to sign, and the non-disclosure agreement was for 25 years. And that they would share the rest of the orders with me after I signed the non-disclosure agreement. And I was given a Polaroid camera and a checklist. And then I read the rest of the orders, and what we were about to do was go downrange to the impact area or the target area for the rockets I had shot the day before. Yeah. And on this list, this set of orders, I was going to be examining road wheels, sight glasses, antenna mounts, main frontal armor, top armor, rear deck armor, pneumatic tires, axles, engine blocks, a variety of pieces of equipment. It didn't dawn on me in the moment when I was reading through this list that anywhere on this list were humans. Yeah. Absolutely did not dawn on me. So I went to my commander and said, "I'm going to be leaving. I've got orders." He said, "For what?" I said, "I can't tell you." He said, "What do you mean you can't tell me?" I said, "I just signed a non-disclosure agreement, and it's got a threat of going to Leavenworth. If I tell you, I said, I'm just going to be gone. I don't know how for how long, but I will come back as soon as I'm done with doing what I'm supposed to be doing." He said, "Roger that," and I got in the helicopter and I flew away. We flew downrange to the impact area, and we saw the smoke and all the fires raging, and we landed about 500-600 meters away, and the rotor wash, was pushing down. We had what we call brownout, which is where the sand and stuff flies up, and there was just the smell of rotor wash and dirt. But once the blades calmed down and the rotor wash stopped, the odor of and the smells of battle, I'm not going to go into graphic detail, but the smell of burning rubber and burning flesh and other things, that olfactory sense is really strong. It's connected right into your vagal nerve, and it just gets burned into your brain. And I'll tell you that I didn't even make it to the edge of the impact area before I retched a couple times. Now, the guys that I were with, I don't know where they came from or what they did before, but clearly these were battle-hardened guys. And their job was to provide security for me. And as we walked into that impact area and I started to do my business, of course, we came across people who didn't die as a result, but had been mortally wounded. And unfortunately, they had been told by their superiors that if they were taken alive, that we would do horrible things to them, some of which would prevent them from entering their paradise. And so rather than be captured, they opted to martyr themselves. And as I walked around the impact area, one after another, enemy combatants took their lives and hollered Allahu Akbar and put an AK in their mouth and blew their brains out. And that caused me to retch several times because it happened over and over and over again. The ones that didn't take their lives, the security detail shot in very short order. So I did my inspections, took my pictures, did my duty, and became extremely numb. Just, it was a survival mechanism, just numbed out. And at one point, there was a gentleman on the ground, and the way the equipment was situated, I had to step over his, what I thought was dead body, and he was extremely burnt. Think hot dog when you're a kid over a fire and the skin turns black. That's what the body looked like. And when I stepped over his body, I heard this noise that sounded like a brown paper bag, like a grocery sack, tearing. Mm-hmm. And it startled me really badly. And I turned around, and this gentleman who was laying like this on the ground, had lifted up his arm and opened his eye, and he looked at me with one eye, and the flesh on his arm had ripped. And it scared me to death. And I was fumbling for my weapon. I didn't know what to do. It scared me. And the thought went through my mind, what does he want? And I didn't know whether it was help to try to get me or grab me to exact punishment, or just what it is that he wanted. But before I could respond, one of the security detail members shot him in the head. And then he, of course, was dead. And I was shaken, really shaken by that. And I went on about my business. That night, he paid me another visit, and that was the beginning of my PTSD nightmares. And that dream haunted me for the next probably 27 years of my life. And of course, that was my very first mission and my very first battle damage assessment. And with the non-disclosure agreement, there was literally nobody that I could talk to, nobody to share that burden with. And I kind of took it on as a responsibility of duty. West Point's motto is duty, honor, country.
Yeah.
And I kind of took that burden, maybe like Paul took his stripes.
Yeah.
It was my duty.
Yeah.
And so I owned it. I shoved it in deep, and we say drive on, and that's what I did. But I was in an incredible amount of pain, just absolute agony. I was pretty sure that where I had been, God was not.
Yeah.
And I was pretty sure that based upon what I had done, I was going to hell. There was no recovery from this. And so in the subsequent missions that we fired and that I was responsible for, I had this incredibly, I can't think of the right word to describe for it, inwardly hateful feeling about myself. And I believed about myself that I had become a monster, a killer. That was who I believed I was, and that I was remorseless, had no respect for humanity and no concern for human beings, period. And that was going to be my lot. That was going to be I was going to be punished for what I was currently in the process of doing, although it was my duty. Very definite moral confliction between what I believed to be right and true and my responsibility as a soldier, as an officer, as a man who raised his right hand and said, I do solemnly swear. And so that part of the war was over. We did the ground offensive and moved off to back to Garrison. There were some other events that happened that were part of the combat experience that didn't affect me that way. There were some direct action stuff where my life was threatened, and I took action to defend myself, and I don't have those same kind of feelings about that. That was a mano-a-mano kind of event. But when you're shooting somebody that's 30 kilometers away, that maybe getting a drink out of their cup, the next thing you know, they're being decimated, that's a different kind of feeling it was a different kind of feeling for some reason to me. When I got back stateside after that deployment, and being convinced that I was a condemned, convicted by my higher power, by Christ, killer, I had decided, maybe subconsciously at that point at first, that I wanted no part of the Army anymore.
Yeah.
And so I started, I think, mentally finding a reason to get out of the Army, that I did not want to be part of killing anymore.
When did you leave the military?
I left within 13 months of getting back from deployment.
Wow. When did God pick up the pieces in your life?
So, way fast forward, I had a successful business career, had a successful marriage, coach youth basketball, all that stuff, all the while having this nightmare.
Yeah.
Not able to share, not able to talk about for fear. Wouldn't even go to a therapist and talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
I did talk to my father one time about it, and unfortunately I got the advice to have a stiff drink.
Yeah.
If it's bothering your sleep. And I developed alcoholism. And when I retired, or I succumbed to alcoholism, I should say. When I retired at 43 from civilian work, because I had a pretty successful civilian career, I sought help. And I went to the VA. And I went through the rounds of psychotropic medicines and cognitive behavioral therapy. If there's an alphabet combination of letters for therapy, I've done it. And it wasn't until I met a chaplain who happened to be a West Point grad who recommended or suggested that I might have a spiritual malady and that maybe I should seek help from a spiritual angle, that I got help. And I initially went to a place called Camp Hope in Houston, and I was able to work out at that facility my PTSD and my guilt and my shame over what I had done in combat.
Have you heard about the Mighty Oaks program?
I have not heard about Mighty Oaks.
We're going to talk about Mighty Oaks, and that's a vacation, both physically and spiritually, and it doesn't matter where you're at, even if you overcome. It's still it's a great thing that we'll talk about that after we get off the camera today. But it is evident that that you're walking with Christ now, and that event, that sucked, and it sucks for so many that do have to sign non-disclosures and that do keep it in. What I was surprised about most when I first deployed was the amount of those people walking around that you described. I was like, who are these people, and why do they have beards, and they have no name tags,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really interesting. It's interesting, all the dynamics that go on, and you don't ever think about that. The things that you talked about, that were so insightful and so personal, and we really appreciate that because this is going to help somebody else, and it's also going to help, with your family and your friends as well. I would love to talk to you, for hours on end more. We don't have the space of time with this interview to do that, but I'm just excited that where you're at right now.
Well, I'm going to challenge you because I want to talk to you about the restoration that Christ has made in my life. And so my initial was to lay that burden at his feet and come back and talk to you about what he's done with this vessel since he took that burden away from me. And I'm not telling you it's been a non-bumpy road, but I'm telling you that he continues to work in my life, and he's liberated me, and he's given me purpose again. And I love the opportunity to come back, either on camera or off, and talk to you about that.
We'll do it. Well, brother, I want to thank you
Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming
Appreciate
today.
it.
I want to thank you for sharing. When we do these interviews, we don't have a lot of information, and we purposely don't prep with questions because we're having a conversation. We found that when we just start having an honest conversation, amazing things happen, and an amazing thing happened today. That story, it's overwhelming, and the things that people don't realize that we do in service, and what you did in service, and I want to thank you for your service. I just want to thank you for sharing about what Christ has done in your life, and I want to thank you for just being honest with us about the pain, and we just are so honored to have you on the Honor Cafe Hall of Heroes. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you.
All right.